Ladies and gentlemen, descendants of genocide victims and survivors, members of the Federal Parliament, Your Grace, good evening. Thanks for allowing me just a few minutes to say a few words about the history behind what we represent tonight. And it's not the first time I've been upstaged by a 10-year-old boy, I can assure you. I'm a military historian. I'm a research professor at the University of New South Wales, Canberra. And as Haig said a few years ago, with the cooperation of an Australian-Armenian writer, Vicken Babkenian, we produced that book, Armenia, Australia and the Great War. It was a great privilege for me to work with Vicken. I spent most of my career not in academia, but in museums. I wasn't the director of the memorial, I was its principal historian. And that meant that I didn't write for academics. I wrote for ordinary people, ordinary Australians. And as a result of that, I wanted to make history meaningful for the people for whom we wrote books. With that in mind, I want to make just three minor points, or brief points. The first is, how do we know that the genocides that you represent tonight happened? Well, of course, the evidence, the historical evidence, the international historical evidence is overwhelming. But some of that evidence comes from, as Haig said, from Australians, members of the Australian Light Horse, Australian members of the Imperial Camel Corps, and Australians, many of whom had been captured on Gallipoli as prisoners of war of the Ottoman Turks. So we know it happened. The second point is that Australia's efforts to succour, to assist, to relieve the suffering of those who had been victims of the genocide began during the First World War and continued long after it. It's probably the first significant international humanitarian effort that Australia has been involved in. It involved literally millions of Australians across the country. That's something that Australians didn't know until Vicken did his research, and it's something we should not forget. And the third point I'd like to make, and my final point, is that this is not just an Armenian, an Assyrian, and a Pontic Greek story. This is an Australian story, because you are all Australians. It's a story which Australians were a part of from the very beginning. It's a story that Australians witnessed, and it's a story that you Australians witness to today. So Australians ought to pay attention to their history in the First World War, as we do, but part of that history is the story of Australia's relationship to the genocide and its victims. And I would certainly endorse Haig's point that Australians should know about this, should recognise it, and should acknowledge it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.